A little bit more quiet. Okay. So today we're just going to talk about self-managed abortion and other forms of like pregnancy care, pregnancy loss, criminalization, and kind of like the history of medicalization and carceralization of repro care, and so including abortion and other types of reproductive care, and like how self-managed abortion can serve as a direct act of resistance to the system. So first we'll just like introduce the panelists we have here, and then Sophia and I are going to be sort of leading the panel discussion, and then we're going to be doing our self-managed abortion training that just will teach you a little bit more information about what self-managed abortion is. Okay.
All right, so first we'll introduce Hennessy. Hennessy Garcia, pronouns she, they, is a queer Afro-Latinx student studying environmental science at SUNY Medgar Evers College. SUNY Medgar Evers College. They're also studying data analytics in an online degree program at Southern New Hampshire University. Hennessy is also an organizer, activist, abolitionist, and intersectional feminist. They work in community with NYC for Abortion Rights and the Reproductive Justice Collective. They additionally work in community with NY Renews and Public Power NY.
Next we have Nix, who's sitting in the middle, and I have the pleasure of so Niharka, or Nix Rao, uses they, she pronouns, is an abortion doula and organizer with New York City for Abortion Rights, the Reproductive Justice Collective, and Advocates for Youth. Their work focuses on confronting the connections between the criminal legal system and reproductive access through legislative advocacy, clinical defense, and self-managed abortion awareness. So then we have Rafa, who's our special guest today. Rafa Kidvai uses they, them pronouns. They're JD, they're the Legal Defense Fund Director at If When How. Prior to joining If When How, Rafa was a public defender at the Legal Aid Society's Brooklyn Criminal Defense Practice, Legal Fellow at Court Watch NYC, and Director of Immigrant Justice / Paul Rappaport Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Rafa's work and activism has focused on queer and trans liberation, supporting survivors of intimate partner violence, economic justice, family defense, immigrant justice, and prison abolition. So we're just going to sit here and get started.
All right, so we'll start off just kind of with an overall definition of what you mean by self-managed abortion.
I can take this. So basically self-managed abortion, though I think its most common form right now is abortion with pills, at least like the most talked about form. It's really just inducing an abortion through like non-clinician supported means, kind of like outside of what we call like the standard medical care system. And I think important to note, and I know we're going to be talking about this extensively, is that self-managed abortion was the way to access abortion for a very long time, and the way abortion was done before like the medicalization and later criminalization that accompanies medicalization of abortion care. So there are many methods, again, that you can self-manage your abortion. Since like the 1980s, because of the invention of mifepristone, people use abortion with pills, which is basically two types of pills, mifepristone and misoprostol. You'll learn more about this in the self-managed abortion info sessions. I don't want to go too in depth. You can also use vacuum to create your own manual vacuum aspirator for later abortions, like after 10 weeks. Yeah, there's other also methods that have historically been used, like herbs, specifically pennyroyal, pansy root, and black cohosh. But yeah, that's some context for self-managed abortion.
Do you guys have anything to add on that?
No, that was it.
Okay, so next, like, we want to move on to what is the history of the criminalization of abortion and reproductive care.
we thought perhaps Rafa could answer that. You guys can add.
Yeah, I'm just going to frame this a little bit, but I really want Laura, if you're still up for it, to share a little bit. So just so you know, Laura is like the researcher around SMA criminalization, and she just happens to be here. And so I feel like I want to milk her brilliance. But really, some of the things that I want to remember about the history of criminalization and the history of criminalization in the repro setting is that the same folks are criminalized across the board, regardless of the laws that are used. And so this is just one of the venues of criminalization. And so what we know about criminalization in general is that the state has an impetus to criminalize certain bodies, specifically Black and brown bodies. Specifically, this country was built on a history of enslavement and genocide of Indigenous people, and that's not absent from our laws. That is very much the foundation of our laws. And so anything that follows really perpetuates those systems, which is, I imagine, why we're all talking about abolition, is that we need to move out of that framework that we're in. But most sort of rights-based work is really rooted deeply in those frameworks and in white supremacy. And so the criminalization of abortion looks pretty much, at least in terms of who's targeted, the same. We have a lot of queer and trans people that are targeted, poor people, immigrants, communities that really would feel reticent to engage with the formal medical system. And so if you think about who feels uncomfortable to access clinical care or cannot access clinical care, there's a number of reasons why people self-manage their abortions. It could be because, lack of access. It could be because that's the method that seems good to them. But that criminalization of self-managed abortion in the repro setting is predominantly where we see the criminalization of abortion taking place. And that's been true prior to Dobbs, prior to the sort of fall of Roe. And that's where I would love Laura to step in.
Sure. Yeah, so we've been working on doing research documenting cases where people have been criminally investigated or arrested for self-managing their abortion or helping someone else do so. That research we've been doing for the last couple of years, and it's focused on public records. So the cases that we've become aware of are through public information requests or through the media. And we have done work on collecting the public records of those cases and then analyzing them to understand more about who's being targeted and how those cases are making their way into and through the criminal process. And all of that research is also within the context of larger research that's been done for a long time in pregnancy criminalization writ large by many academics and activists. And what we've found is at least 61 cases between 2000 and 2020, which is sort of a good window to look at, given that that's when medication abortion became on the market. And what we've seen and what Rafa alluded to is it's an extension of the criminal legal system. The same communities who have been targets of that system are also largely the targets of the cases that we know about. It's not all of the information. We can't know everything about every case, but what we know is that individuals who have been arrested or investigated end up becoming subject to the systems and crime and punishment that are part of the criminal legal system, family separation system, the immigration detention system. Among the adult cases, which is the cases that we have most of the information about because of the secrecy that's in the juvenile court system. We know that people of color were disproportionately represented when compared to the larger population. For cases where people's case proceeded through the court process, the majority were either represented by public defenders or pro bono, so we're low incomes. And we also, one of the big sort of realities that we see through these cases is just the larger harm that can happen when someone's not just convicted, but also investigated by law enforcement. So that's just a really sort of snapshot on what can happen. We've released preliminary findings and we're working on larger findings now, but
The only thing, thank you, Laura. I think the only thing that I would really add, which is really information that you've given me, is that regardless of whether they're explicit laws really criminalizing self-managed abortions and self-managed care, prosecutions have taken place across the country regardless of these laws. And so prosecutors, this is just something that's true about prosecutors in general. I don't really pretend to like prosecutors or care for them very much structurally, and so I'm not going to do that here either. Prosecutors structurally are trained to be terrible human beings that try to trap people the easiest way that they can. And so if the impetus is to trap people, they will use any laws that exist, regardless of whether they map on clean to abortion or not. You know, you can see this in many settings outside of the repro setting too. If you're a survivor of intimate partner violence and the state really has no real understanding of intimate partner violence or violence at all, seeing that they don't even consider state violence to be violence. I think, you know, when people are criminalized as survivors, the way that those cases come in aren't going to look like anything that you understand. They might come through as a pettit larceny case where someone is criminalized for having stolen something, or a burglary. And then you find out that actually the impetus for the case is a really complicated web of power and control, where someone was coerced in some way, or there are many dynamics at play. And so in the repro setting, kind of similarly, right? Prosecutors use any laws that they can find. If they have the will to prosecute, they will find the way to do so. And so, you know, prosecutions have taken place in about 26 states, but only 3 states really have had laws that have explicitly criminalized self-managed abortion. And then the last thing I'll say before I read it, sorry, I'm being verbose, but the last thing I would really say is that, like, I think going forward, we've had a lot of fear about what criminalization will look like. And I think instead of imagining it as something completely different or new, really what we're going to see is exactly the same kinds of criminalization. And again, I think self-managed abortion, because of limited access to clinical care, which we're seeing across the country, will continue to be the venue by which people need to have abortions. And that criminalization will continue to exist the same way that I think it probably has before. Do you feel like that's true?
Absolutely, yeah. And the cases will proceed similarly too. I think we've learned a lot about how the cases will happen and what information is going to be used as evidence, what's not. And we have to be conscious of looking towards those cases to be able to help defend people in the right ways to get the cases dismissed.
Right, this question's for Hennessy. Can you describe how the NYPD works as an arm of the state to restrict abortion access in New York? And how has this impacted your organizing?
So I'm a clinic defender with New York City for abortion rights, and it's actually so it's next. But so what we've noticed is that the NYPD, they escort clinic harassers. And in the past few months, they actually arrested our members of our team and just people who showed up to our clinic defense. And a lot of the times it's just like we're trying to make sure the patients aren't intercepted or harassed by antis. Because imagine 150 people praying, and in my case, I was like, I'm not even going for an abortion, I'm going for an IUD thing. But it's imagine other people who are going in for an abortion or anything related to that. It's scary to have people just come up to you and be like, oh my God, here's all this scientifically false information. Or oh my God, we'll pray for you and your baby. And it's okay. And the NYPD they're really bad at enforcing the FACE Act, which is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances, which the FACE Act honestly itself is just quite complicated. But literally these people aren't supposed to be right in front of the clinic as they are, but the NYPD allows them, which is a little bit messed up. Sorry, I'm exhausted. And I don't really think the NYPD impacts my organizing. They're the thing I'm fighting. In every space, the NYPD are the most violent actors. And quite literally, with the amount of things we've been seeing. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I feel like I don't have anything.
No, thank you.
Do you want to
add like a little bit of either view of like what happens at the clinic defenses and what the NYPD does specifically?
Yeah, I think I can talk a little bit more about this. I think there's an idea that criminalization only happens in quote unquote red states. But I think like especially uplifting the work of formerly NAPW, but now Pregnancy Justice that works in New York. They've been focusing on broader pregnancy criminalization across, like not even in the context of abortion. So, there are multiple cases in New York where people have been criminalized for using drugs while pregnant, which, defeats the idea of bodily autonomy and it not being like, a separate entity or ward of the state. There's also instances of criminalization where people have been charged with manslaughter for, causing physical harm indirectly to their fetus. I think in a notable case, someone was shot by someone else in the stomach while pregnant, and they were charged with manslaughter. I really want you to look up Pregnancy Justice. They really do amazing work around this. But providing that context to say that we already have, even in places like New York, the police acting as a conduit to pregnancy criminalization at large. And then I think what you see specifically at abortion clinics is like a level of support, a level of coordination with anti-abortion actors, with far-right actors. I think it just reiterates how the police functions not only as an arm of capital, but very concretely as an arm of this far-right Christian apparatus, right? Like they are predominantly white men who are standing outside of the clinic, and a lot of the defenders, like Hennessy and I, are brown femmes. Who do you think is the group that is being brutalized and arrested as a result of it, pushing back against the harassment? What we do with the blockade is basically just delay their procession from the church to the actual clinic, so the clinic is able to remain free of harassers for as long as possible. Yeah, we've had a lot of, actually since Dobbs, you've seen an increase in arrests. We thought the police may like back off a little because of all the spotlight, but they were like, no. Which like my fault for thinking that really. So that's some context for our clinic defense work. And I think the reason we wanted to talk about it is it provides like, I think with abortion, not everyone thinks about abortion until they like need one. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God. But even if you're on the streets in Soho, of all places, right? You can see this very clear coordination between the police state and far-right forces. And I think that's important to note because that's in New York City.
Yeah.
Like there's this like, I don't want to say he's famous, but like he's very well known in the anti-abortion space. So his name is Fidelis Montinsky. Oh my goodness. And the NYPD has escorted him numerous of times. And currently right now, he actually has a restraining order for any clinic. So he cannot be in proximity to any clinic, but it's like, he's like the NYPD is still kind of somehow gets him like almost near it. And even then they didn't even know about his own restraining order until like we were like, no, like he literally has a restraining order, like here you go.
Yeah. But yeah, like we're getting arrested for blocking traffic,
Blocking
blocking pedestrian traffic. Like it's crazy.
If any of you have encountered the LRAD that plays at every protest, I think that's another important thing to note. The strategic response group of the NYPD that conducts these protests is the same group that's deployed against Black Lives Matter protests. And really they're like a modern version, not modern, they're the current version of the riot police, really. So you often, and they're volunteer based, and their incidents of violence, the New York City Liberties Union does amazing work around this. Their incidence of violence is actually higher than the average NYPD officer, because it's like people who volunteer to do extra policing, especially around protests. So again, I think that just connects, like Rafa was saying earlier, the criminalization we're seeing, the police action that we're seeing is not anything new. It's just a continuation of existing forms of domination and brutalization, just enacted in this specific context.
Okay, so it's sort of definitely a similar question, but we wanted to like get Rafa's ideas on like what has changed on the ground, I guess, especially in like the legal world since Dobbs, and like what role is the police and carceral system playing?
It's a really good question. So a couple of things I wanted to think about is like, who are cops? Do we even have a shared understanding of who a cop is? I think most comfortably we think of like a police officer, right? They're a cop. Prosecutors are cops. Judges can be cops. I feel like if you signed up to work in criminal court, where your job is at least sending some people to jail, like you made the decision, whether you're like conceiving of yourself as a good judge or not, who doesn't do that often. You do it sometimes, enough times to buy into it. So not my favorite people either. But then ACS workers are cops, CPS everywhere else, or often. Every time you talk to someone who is intervening in your family, surveilling in your family, alleged, framed as a social worker, we have a lot of ACS workers are like trained social workers. We're coming and talking to people. They're not telling you that your words are being used against you. It's like not any different from the sort of Miranda warning kind of that you should get in family court too, which is that like everything you say to ACS workers can be used against you. There are cops all around us. When people are mandated reporters, it can get really, really murky. Sometimes we engage in cop-like behavior, not knowing that we are. We're told that it's keeping people safe. We're told that it allows us to keep our jobs. So I think there's ways in which mandated reporters can sort of fall under that umbrella also. So one, I think we need to think of cops as like much more expansive as just the police officers. And then when we do that, let's just remember not to talk to them if we don't really fucking need to, right? Like that's not good. It's never worked out for anybody. I've never had a criminal case where someone's declared something to an officer, even if it was completely exculpatory, to say like, I didn't do this, or a declaration of innocence where it wasn't used against them. So that's the first piece. In terms of what's changed after Dobbs is that I think one, stigma is really, really huge. And I think the line between stigma to criminalization is actually pretty clean. So something is stigmatized because someone thinks it's wrong. Okay. We leap in this country into jumping into criminalizing things that we think are quote unquote wrong. And so if you have this proliferation of stigma nationally, it doesn't matter what the actual laws say to some extent, right? Like abortion providers talk about how confusing it is to practice because it's hard to know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do when the landscape is changing. It's obviously not an accident either. We're like intentionally being kept confused. So there's a lot of confusion that I think has really tangible costs. I was just talking to a provider yesterday who talked about how someone, made a lot of difficult decisions to be able to travel out of state to access an abortion they never needed to have left the state for in the first place. Because in fact, their provider was wrong about the extent of the situations in which they could provide that abortion. The other thing is that like prosecutors are people, and for the most part, not very smart people. And so when you give people like that who are vindictive structurally, this is not personal, it's institutional. People talk about being prosecutors because of things like I experienced IPV and now I would like something to shift. Like totally benevolent intent sometimes coming from valid places of trauma. To actually get to a prosecutor's office, I can't tell you how many times I've interacted with prosecutors in the first 4 years of their life where they said, I didn't sign up for this job that I'm currently doing. And the job that I'm currently doing is sending someone to prison for cocaine use over and over again, and then making them homeless, making them experience trauma. Like that's not what I signed up for. So I think even prosecutors don't know what they signed up for when they got there. But I think part of what happens with prosecutors is that, and I say not so smart, like again, in a non-personal way, sometimes personal, but often just structurally, but just to say that they don't know what the law is, they don't know what law they're using to criminalize who. And so in Dobbs, in the face of confusion, I think that's a huge thing. And then I think the thing that we have to worry about is not that self-managed abortions haven't already been criminalized like we talked about. It's that when you limit access, that there is obvious and there's still need, like you're just going to see more. And then, you know, I think some of the things about SB 8 in Texas that we heard a lot about, which are these bounty hunter laws, regardless of whether those laws are legal, whether like you can actually follow through that lawsuit or win that lawsuit, the fact that you can bring one is harassment enough. But then really it's creating this idea. There's this artist, Micah Bazant, who made this beautiful poster called, which says like, I'm totally fucking it up, but it's like, I don't want my community to watch me, I want them to see me. And I think that's what really we're seeing. It's like the New York City subway, see something, say something. And that I think is actually the scariest part, is like, we don't understand whether something is wrong or bad. Often people are being told that they're at risk if they don't report something for also being harmed by the state. And so all that confusion, all that stigma, all that collective trauma within all these systems, immigration, like Laura said, family regulation, criminal, coming together really. I think it's what the difference is really, there's a will that's, I think, pretty bold. And again, where there's a will, I feel like, yeah, there's a way, I guess. Yeah.
No, I think that was really great and like sad, but true. Yeah.
All right, for next, why does the state work to criminalize and police abortion? And maybe talk about like a little bit about surplus population and white supremacist criminalization.
Yeah, thanks for those suggested prompts of what to talk about. I would love to like open this up to like even folks here's thoughts, but I've been thinking about this a lot. Understandably, I think doing this type of work. I think one of foundational to learning about abolition first was understanding how criminalization creates this surplus labor population for us, right? Because if you are able to criminalize people, you intentionally like have them often working extremely menial jobs for some cents on an hour. And not only that, it leads to massive increases in systemic poverty and things of that nature. Obviously, like, I mean, one of the most frustrating parts about, you know, this so perceived increase in crime is doubling down on criminalization, because that's just going to lead to more people, you know, not having jobs and having to go off for 6 months and then like being in even more dire economic situations. But so thinking of all of that in the context of why are things criminalized, why is abortion care in particular criminalized, I think is important, because we see this as, you know, a creation of a way to like essentially reproduce white supremacist values, keep people of color stuck within the penal and carceral system, and use it in a way like Marxist theory posits to create a surplus labor population, which means that you're able to pay people less because there's always going to be people more desperate for your job. And that's why I think, you know, I view criminalization in the context of the capitalist white supremacist system we have, and then reproductive justice and reproductive care as part of that broader context. I know we haven't talked about the medicalization of reproductive care much, but again, like I said at the start earlier, you know, used to have midwifery and at-home births and women's care or women's health. I don't think any of us up here are women, but not the point. What is referred to as women's health was something that was outside of the formal medical system. And then moving it into the actual medical system allowed for criminalization, and was done because, in my opinion, of they didn't believe that women could look after women themselves and be a profit motive, right? Like this was done during a time where medicalization was like really expanding as a field. The history of American gynecology is deeply also rooted in white supremacist attitudes, and literally, you know, experimenting on the bodies of enslaved people. So it makes in my opinion, sense that all those systems would develop and layer on top of each other and end up in a situation where you now have Black and brown people being criminalized for, you know, trying to exercise their bodily autonomy. And there's a lot of concepts in what I just said, but I think they're important to think about when considering this issue.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear more from y'all. If you have
Yeah, anything else to add on?
You said a lot of good things, obviously, but the thing that I would just add is that I think in the gender affirming care front, that we're seeing this sort of national unprecedented attack on trans people. The thing to remember is that gender affirming care has also, much like self-managed abortions and reproductive care, always the formality is the new part, right? The like formalization of these systems having to access the care is new, and then therefore what follows is like punishment and criminalization. But people have been providing this care to each other for a long time, and I think that it's like, not to sound like too simplistic about it, but I feel like the antidote to a lot of systemic harm is safe and strong communities and really profound, thoughtful, safe, loving connections. And that's what abortion care provides. That's what gender affirming care provides. And so it's really this like total attack on the things that keep us alive. Incarceration is no different. We know that human connection, the lack of it is physically painful. People experience solitary confinement as actual physical pain, the way that they would, physical pain. And so I think similarly, there's this, that's the only thing I'd add is that like, the problem is really with the formalization of these systems is that it pretends like these things haven't always been happening and puts them in a vacuum, but in fact they have. People will forever be providing each other gender affirming care and support informally. That's the majority of care right now.
Yeah, so honestly, our next topic kind of really involves that. I know like our question was just going to be how can folks get involved with self-managed abortion work, but definitely like we were thinking next could talk about, you know, doula work and support, and like on that front, self-managing abortions is very much like this like community care sort of form. So yeah, just like how can people get involved with self-managed abortion work and like what does that entail?
I think each of us could go because I think we all do SMA work and we can talk about how to get involved. I'm an abortion doula. That basically means supporting people both in New York and in criminalized states through their abortion. I think the best way for folks to get involved is really to spread information about accessing abortion. Like Rafa was talking about, a lot of the precursor to criminalization and the lack of access to options is the stigmatization of abortion care. So really, like, I mean, we're going to share resources later, but telling people like, hi, abortion pills are available by mail in all 50 states. That's a reality. Not many people know about it. And, you know, I mean, our orgs can put up as many social media infographics as we want, and we do, and they're great. Don't get me wrong. But nothing beats the security and safety of hearing it from someone in your community and knowing that that's a resource and a person you can trust. And so that's one way I think you can spread the word and be involved in this type of work. Another way is also to push back against criminalization. Like Rafa was talking about, like I like to think have a little cop inside of us sometimes. And that allows us not only to reenact that sort of behavior, but also I think see it visible in the systems that surround us, right? Like think about getting permits for protests. Why do we need to do that? Is that the best way to go about organizing a protest? Think about reporting. Like if someone tells you something in confidence, you have to be careful about where you're going to be sharing that information, because I mean, some of the work that I know Ifwen Howe has done is a lot of the people who actually end up reporting self-managed abortion are the doctors and community members and like friends and family and people, you know, you would think to trust. So that's something I think we all need to confront over why we're using these systems and these institutions that have, in my opinion, only heaped harm on all of us. and why we're looking to them as some form of solution. But I'll pass it to Hennessy or Rafa.
So additionally with like spreading information, like honestly, the first thing that pops into my head is like comes out. And like we did, or well, this was like in December, but in December we did like a SMA pop-up where we were explaining information. And I grew up in the Bronx myself, so besides like all the like environmental racist crap there going on and just the predominantly poor and Black and brown population there, literally we were there and people were like, we never heard of like medication abortion. And even when I explained this to my own mom, she's like, I've never heard of this. And I'm like, well, you're welcome. But but in the Bronx, it was really interesting to see people who didn't entirely agree with us, because it's like, you know, we're working on it. A lot of poor populations sometimes lean on the conservative view, but it's like to actually engage with the community with food and to talk with them, even if they don't entirely agree, it works. Additionally, with like, I do think like more direct action, like for ways to get involved. Like honestly, like clinic defense is an act of resistance, and say what you want because it's quite controversial in the repro space, but like the patients appreciate our presence there. And honestly, like the cops do not even help these patients. These patients are constantly getting harassed or intercepted. And it's like when we're there, the patients do feel much better, especially because we'll have like a group of people, they'll block with like umbrellas, these people praying across the street. And it does provide like some form of like calmness for people trying to enter the clinic. And even then, like managing your own abortion is an act of resistance in itself, because it's like you're literally controlling what literally goes into your body. And we do have some resources.
We'll share them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then lastly, like we were just
I
wondering,
think-
yeah, if that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
If Rafa could sort of like explain the work you do with Repro Legal Defense Fund and how it works.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us and letting me talk about the RLDF. Literally, Laura will tell you because we work together. If I could talk about it all day, all the time, I would. So, okay. Thank you for talking about feeling the gulf inside you. I feel like it is one of those like mantras that I used to say when I was a public defender every morning, because it's so easy to walk into that courtroom and like schmooze with some asshole just to make your life easier. And it's like, you know, you have to kind of remind yourself, like, this is for my own comfort. I'm doing this thing where I'm smiling at someone who's just done something really harmful out of, like, I don't know whether it's like upbringing or whatever. Like, you don't have to shame yourself for why there's a cop inside you, but there is one. And so I don't know, go ham. So thank you for that. In terms of the RLDF, the Repro Legal Defense Fund really started to support folks that were going to be criminalized for self-managed abortions, because that's where we were seeing repro criminalization really taking place. And then the other place that we really see repro criminalization, or something that we learned, is that pregnant people are really at risk for criminalization as a genre, right? Like it's really dangerous being pregnant, medically, legally. And because the risk for self-managed abortion isn't a medical one, so thanks for telling your mom about pills, it's really a legal one. And that's really the problem that we're facing. And so it started like that, but you know, based on what we know, it's back to what I said, it's really hard to know if something is a self-managed abortion case. For instance, when someone comes to talk to you for legal support, they might not conceive of their actions as having been to end a pregnancy, or they might have. We have people who are criminalized for self-managed abortions because their abusive partners might be reporting them for wanting to take their bodies into their own hands, because it feels devastating and terrifying to have to imagine a life where you co-parent with someone, your life is at risk. And so really extending to supporting people that are experiencing state surveillance and criminalization during pregnancy, and not just limiting that to abortion. And I think partly why that's helpful as a bail and legal defense fund is that, like, you know, when I was public defender, if I had gone to a bail fund to pay money and they'd said, but tell me, did your client intend to do this thing? I would have been like, fuck off. Like, your job is not to figure out what's happening in this case. Your job is to get my client free. And so I don't want to forget that piece of myself. That feels like I don't want to be sitting here parsing through someone's intent, their life circumstances before it comes to paying for their freedom and just getting them out, right? So I think that's the first piece, is like really expanding to that. And then realizing that because all these harms happen together in the immigration and the family systems, that like something that I think we all failed at when I was a public defender is sitting with our clients and asking them like, what is the thing that you're most concerned about right now? Like, why is that not a question that I was trained to ask people? You know, mostly I was like so focused on making sure someone didn't have a criminal record. I wasn't thinking about like, is your fear really the misdemeanor in your record, or is your fear losing your children? Because like, let's focus on the fear that you have. And so again, that's part of why with the RLDF, we were like, someone's biggest fear is going to be different depending on who they are and where they are and who's targeting them. And so really expanding our support across the board in family, immigration, and criminal systems if they're being targeted. Yeah, that's the work that we do. Oh, and the one thing I would say is that like something that we feel really strongly about is that like really not thinking about financial support as legal financial support as just being like bail or attorney's fees, but thinking really expansively, because the thing that causes the barrier to someone coming to court and getting a warrant so often in practice we would find is like childcare, housing, like survival things. And so really making sure that we're making it possible for people to survive, which I think is kind of the goal. But sometimes with legal organizations, you forget why you're there. And so that's something that we're really trying to ground ourselves in, making sure that we're responding to the need, whether it's like housing is the need, or whether it's the cell phone, or whether it's, yeah, you know, thinking expansively. And then finally, I think you said something about safety, and the reason it stuck out for me is, apart from the fact that yes, if one has done research and we know that the primary risk to each other is not some fancy surveillance app or whatever, like it's really going to be each other. And so I feel like something that I've really learned is that this is a moment and a call to action to learn how to be safe to other people yourself. So like some of the work doesn't have to be so external. Like the work can just be thinking about how you're showing up. Like, are you retelling people's private stories just by virtue of gossip in your regular life? Like, is that making it unsafe for survivors? Kind of, sometimes. Like, should we change that in ourselves? For sure. And so is the risk, learn how to be safe yourself, I feel like is such an important piece. And then across the board, I just need us to do better by virtue of pregnant people on so many fronts. But I think substance use is a huge one for me, is that like, you got to get yourself to a place where you're not judging pregnant people for keeping themselves alive, right? Like you've got to train yourself to do that. And I've had to chip away at myself, my own internal thoughts so much to get there. I remember when I first moved to New York, I saw a pregnant person standing on a street corner smoking a cigarette. And I remember my initial thought, because it was so fucked up and oppressive, it was like, don't you even care about blah, blah. Like we have those thoughts. Mashallah, I have moved myself away from those thoughts, but they come to us from our training. And so like, be safer for the people around you, be safer for the people in your life. I feel like that's so often the work, you know? But then don't replicate all the structures that exist. Like you don't have to create a whole new bail fund. You don't have to create a whole new, like,
Abortion
fund. You don't have to, there's people that exist. Like it's really exciting to try to be at the center of something when it's happening, but like check yourself about that too. You kind of don't have to be. There's people doing that. And in fact, you kind of make it unsafer for people when you're starting from scratch and you are not, because you don't have the time to learn so many of the lessons that I think slowness just allows.
And lastly, like, yeah, we just have a hopeful question of like, what would an abolitionist community-centered vision of reproductive care look like to you guys?
Honestly, like just in general, I think it just starts with like yourself, because it's like it didn't take us overnight to become like abolitionists. That took a lot of experience, maybe some trauma, and just constant learning. So it's like being open to learning. Like, I know it's like, oh my God, abolish the police, super scary. And like, even talking to my parents, like, what you say? And I'm like, oh, nothing. But like, I've engaged with people like my parents who are very much like, they repeat the propaganda that we see online and on TV. And then like, when I explain to them the things I've been through, they're like, oh, that's not right. And I'm like, right. And it's just like those kind of conversations really help. And it's like, for me, I like to think of everybody as abolition potential. Like, so as much as like a lot of people are like, I'm tired of the liberals, like, yes, we're tired of the liberals, but like, we need to engage with said liberals. And even then, it's like everybody has to start somewhere. And I think meeting them where they're at, especially in communities like the Bronx. So our SMA pop-up, that was us literally meeting folks where they were at, because it's like they didn't know what abortion pill was, and now they learned. And yeah, and even then, I think for me, like, abolition is just keeping in mind to have it intersectional. Like, I feel like a lot of times, like when Roe v. Wade was overturned, like, I think a lot of people forgot, like, leading up to that week, a lot of things happened. Like, Indigenous sovereignty was like questioned, and gun control in New York was also like got the ruling, but it definitely was like, it was not in our favor. But then the following week, it was the West Virginia versus EPA, and that was, you would think Roe v. Wade being overturned would make me cry, but the next decision made me cry, because it's like, I do a lot of environmental work, and the fact that people just like are full on like, we're gonna tell you how many carbon emissions are like gonna affect, and it's like, I'm pretty sure the EPA knows that, and it's like they're undermining the EPA. But it's like keeping in mind that all of our struggles are interconnected, because it's like with the environment and repro, like the way I think of it, it's like, if you're constantly exposed to hazardous substances, how do you think that's going to affect your body? How do you think that's going to affect your reproductive system, right? If Black women have the highest maternal mortality rate in the United States, we literally have a problem. So it's like keeping in mind that like trans liberation, Black liberation, environmental justice are literally so important to reproductive health and reproductive care. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was such an amazing answer. I would like to echo so many of those points. Maybe like through that lens, we can think about a future where, there is no police, where abortion and other forms of reproductive care is carried out through a community, instead of something that's individual or like privatized in a hospital, where child rearing and being a parent is also something that falls to the community. I think a lot of non-Western systems tend to look like that, but it can be hard to conceive of that over here. I try to think of a world where people are really, again, going back to that word safe, environmentally safe. They're safe from police violence. They're safe from white supremacy. They're able to access the care they need without having, $800 for a medication abortion when it costs $50 wholesale, imposed upon them. That's why I think a lot of the work of abolition and transformative justice, I like this question, because I think we have to think of that future, and by thinking of that future, I think we realize how many, like Hennessy said, barriers they exist, and how those barriers overlap, and how thinking of those barriers together is really vital in imagining like a liberated future.
Thank you. Yeah, anything to add?
Sort of relatedly, and both said some really incredible things, but I think the thing about intersectionality that feels helpful for me to remember is that the world is unlivable so often. And as someone who wants to feel politicized about all the things, yeah, that Supreme Court term was rough. It was like evisceration of Miranda, death to the planet, death to your body, like cool, good times in America. is that like, if you think about Repro at least as a commitment to, to name Sister Song's definition, which is to safe and sustainable communities, then you don't have to suddenly be newly politicized in a whole new arena. Like, take the arena that you're in and then like bring that lens there, and you're doing repro work. When people apply for jobs at the RLDF, they're always like, I haven't quite done repro work, but I've done family defense work, tried to, work with critical resistance, and to try to dismantle prisons here, like environmental justice work. And I just wish that we felt comfortable enough, or folks felt comfortable enough. And I know people are not trying to take credit, but to think about all of the ways in which you're already dismantling stuff and how it's all a part of repro. And so I think you can come to abolition from so many places. And then I think most importantly, the thing that gives me hope is that like, God, it is such, what we have in place is so profoundly terrible right now that at some point it's just not working. And I think that collective realization is making me really, really hopeful. The number of times I've spoken to people who've been like, are more open to sharing how these systems that are meant to keep us safe have not tangibly kept them safe. I think it's created this openness to that, and that makes me hopeful.
All right, so if no one has anything to add, do you have a question?
Can I ask them or make a comment?
Yeah.
I'm Betty Maloney. I'm with Radical Women and the National Mobilization for Reproductive Justice. And just adding to some of the things that you said from my experience, because I've been defending clinics since 1980. In the Bronx at Dr. Emily's clinic on Southern Boulevard, I was up there for 3 years defending that clinic, and the cops would say, there's no law here but our law. So even though we live in New York where abortion is allowed, the cops still take that position. And then your comment about trusting people or who you talk to. We had an experience, or I did, where defending a clinic. This was when I lived on the West Coast, and it was a clinic that was bombed out of existence. And we had the names of the people that usually were defending the clinic were on paper inside the clinic. So I learned from that, because then I was subpoenaed as one of the leaders. So you never, if you're working in clinic defense, never leave anything in the clinic or any attendance form or anything like that, because then it can be subpoenaed by the other side. And that was a lesson learned. And the other thing is that's going on in New York City is the strategic tactical force or unit that has been out at Planned Parenthood arresting people that are defending the clinic, but they also were arresting people during George Floyd demonstrations. So there's a need to connect those kinds of issues together. And there's going to be a hearing on March 1st. And these cops that are in that unit have a very big, lengthy charges against them, discipline charges that were never acted on. And they have have no oversight. So they have a free rein. And so that's an important, to call attention, because it's very much like the Scorpion unit that was in Memphis.
Yeah.
It's no different. And they got $1 million budget or more. So I think it's real important to connect the issues. It's to call out the police. We did a demonstration on January 22nd in front of a police precinct, and also made the connection to St. Patrick's Cathedral, because the Catholic Church is tied in with supporting the cops coming out to harass clinic defenders. So it's a long fight, but it's worth it.
Do you guys want to take some audience questions? If there's any, or we can do a break.
Yes.
Okay, so are there any other questions? Wow, okay. In the back, I saw your hand first.
So a lot of the cases I looked at with self-managed abortion, some of the evidence used is collected through digital surveillance, text messages, search history, and
I'm just wondering, like, in your experience with clinic defense and looking at self-managed abortion, like, what role does surveillance play, and how do you combat surveillance issues that are on the rise?
I mean, I can talk from, maybe Rafa can talk about like what actually leads to these arrests. I will just say, use Signal, use end-to-end encrypted messaging platforms. The Digital Defense Fund has an excellent reproductive safety guide for accessing pills. There's lots of steps you can take. None of them are perfect. But there exist tools out there. But I'll let you talk about what role surveillance plays in criminalization.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. First of all, surveillance is so often seen as tech. And yes, important to use Signal, definitely use Signal. I feel like I'm a commercial for Signal all the time. Where I'm like, why are we not using Signal for this communication about mushrooms? Like, what is happening? But people are really comfortable using text messages to talk about shit that they shouldn't be. And I think it's like, I get it. I think it's in some ways a trauma response, because if you're being inundated by surveillance, like, how do you parse through every part of your life to do that? I think you have to listen to DDF and make some changes in your personal life. But I also think that, like, let's be real, the New York family court system is a major site of surveillance. And I will tell you, half the people there cannot use a computer. And what that tells me is that the piece that we talked about earlier, which is that surveillance is the people around you, is the reason that text might be handed over is not necessarily because the cops got on your phone. It's probably because someone handed it to them. And something that I saw with evidence all the time as a defense attorney, you get discovery very rarely, because they don't really like to give you their shoddy evidence. But when you get it, you'll see that it's a lot of public information. It's the Facebook search with the banner that's public. It's the Instagram picture that you posted of yourself, or the friend that wrote a comment about you. Like, it's the text, it's the phone, and because the Signal piece feels important, is because cops get on your phone, and we can talk about all the laws that are supposed to protect us, but in practice, like, those are litigation tools. Like, the fact is that cops will go through your phone, right? And so you have to plan for the inevitabilities of that, but I don't think it's as much tech as we're seeing, as we're imagining. There is some tech, like the cops use. We know that they use way more tech than they tell us that they use. We know they're listening way more than we realize that they're listening. But I think the fundamental thing to remember right now is that, like, the data that you have on your phone, that if you are arrested and you have a phone, the cops are going to go through your phone. And so just think through what's going to be on there, but also think about how you are in public and what you're saying in public, because I feel like that stuff is just it's just so much information that they can use against you. And I think family court is important to remember, because it's your relationships. I think that, like, everyone is concerned about period tracker apps. It's official. We can technically be concerned about period tracker apps. It's not that it's not true that they were going to, at some point, go further and further along, because it's always been about our very existence in our whole body. So they're going to keep chipping away at it, right? That's still true, but I think really, I think more than being afraid of surveillance technologies, we need to be afraid of how we're surveilling each other, how we're watching each other, how we're telling on each other, and just talking about ourselves publicly.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We've talked about this internally and like the abortion of the training, but I was wondering if you all had any thoughts on what, or as like from an abolitionist perspective, on the FACE Act and things like the restraining order against development. How to use those flesh, whether to use them or not.
As an abolitionist, my instinct is to not rely on carceral systems at all. I think evidence for this is the fact that the FACE Act, which was passed in the 90s to protect abortion clinics, also applies to churches and crisis pregnancy centers. crisis pregnancy centers are fake abortion clinics that give out medical misinformation and pretend to give you access to abortion when they don't, like at all. And they like tell you you're only 7 weeks along when you could be 14. I'm not going to go into the entire CVC thing, but yeah. So there were people that graffitied a crisis pregnancy center, I think in Florida, and they were charged under the FACE Act. So I think liberalism is always going to try to play both sides of this issue, when I think people here understand that there are no both sides. There's like the domination and white supremacy being subjected onto a group of people. I think that is a lot more accurate than like pretending that this is a debate. So I think because of that, we have to be really skeptical about relying on things like the FACE Act, relying on, you know, antis getting restraining orders, because, you know, it's the same police that are arresting us at the end of the day and surveilling us and subpoenaing comrades in Texas. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the FACE Act, Rafa.
No, but it makes me think of hate crime legislation, which is so often used to target marginalized people. Like, you have a hate crime enhancement for someone who's being accused of like engaging in some violence because of insert oppression here, like racism, and it's largely white people that are being protected from quote unquote racism. So it's the same kind of idea. It does create a dilemma. The one thing I will say though is when it comes to people's personal safety, I think that like I'm not in the business of telling people that they shouldn't keep themselves safe with the very limited fucked up options that they have. Like, I don't really know what to do with the fact that we live here today and on this planet. And I think we need to make better systems, and we need to I need to have an answer to this. We need answers to this problem. And at the same time, like, I'm not going to make an absolute, like, don't keep yourself safe under the circumstances that you're in, because I think sometimes that functions to make survivors feel like they can't make the decisions that they need to do to keep themselves safe. But I don't think that's antithetical to abortion. I don't know, abortion. To abolition. I think abolitionists are here to keep us safe. That's the goal. And so, yeah.
We're a little pressed for time, but we can do like a quick one if you want to go ahead.
Like in the process of helping someone that is like that has like a criminal process going on, you get to talk with someone from the mental health industry, like a forensic psychologist or something like that, or that can also like contribute to help the person that is being like criminalized, something like that. Or like doing process of companionship with victims in those cases.
Sorry, are you talking specifically about doula work, or and like providing support, or are you talking about like?
Like if, sorry, like if someone is like in an open process, like just this process, like
Right.
if they get to have like contact with, for example, like a psychologist that can like provide help, like both ways, like supporting the mental health and also like having a place like in court, right, like help the decision or something like that.
I feel like I know where you're getting at. I think as a community, when we come together for clinic defense and arrests do happen, like we have an incredible like jail court support system where a lot of us come out for, you know, the people that got arrested, unfortunately, and we'll wait there for hours until they come out, so that way they are able to receive any care that they need, or if they need a hug or something. And it's like we're always
Fresh
there.
clothes,
Yeah,
food.
we're there with like food, and in any weather conditions. Like our last arrest, we were there in the pouring rain, freezing rain, and it's in community with other organizations like Crown Heights Care Collective or Abolition Peer Caucus. So it's like being in community with other people does help with that companionship, because it's honestly, we don't all have to be friends, but we can also take care of each other, because like I'm community, your community. That helps.
Yeah, I think I went most like for the legal part.
Yeah, like if you're being criminalized, if you've been arrested, will someone at some point give you the fucking services that you need to take care of yourself? I think the answer is sadly no, because I think we have an adversarial criminal system, which means there's a state that's trying to prosecute you, and then there's like a defense attorney or a defense system that's trying to protect you. And so at least like the times that folks that I've worked with have had access to mental health professionals, it's either been from the side of the defense attorney who's been trying to argue that this person has a whole schema of things happening in their life. When the state does want you to talk to psychiatrists and psychologists, I will tell you it's usually to figure out how to further criminalize you. So yeah, I don't think you can, and I think this goes back to the piece about who's a cop, is that I think state psychiatrists and